this pandemic was this ability to sit anywhere in the world and deliver talks to people anywhere in the world. So, I asked if some of the IIT Gandhinagar students could join, and you all graciously agreed, and they're here. And I think this is fantastic. So thank you again. I will start sharing my screen. Okay. Somebody say yes if you can see the presentation in full screen.
Yes, sir, we can.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So, I'm at IIT Gandhinagar. Our lab is called the Control and Learning of Action Lab, COLA. We abbreviate it like that just for fun. This is our lab logo. But as a group, we've been very interested in understanding how the brain controls movement, and how specifically, how we learn new movements that would be in the domain of skill learning. So, for instance, how do we learn to play the piano, or how do we learn a new complex dance form, or how do we learn to ride a bicycle? That's one kind of learning. The other thing that we've also been interested in quite a bit is a different form of learning called motor adaptation, which is the ability to adapt motor output to changing environmental conditions. And these have been sort of the two broad themes that we have pursued in the lab. So I guess the appropriate place to start is by defining what we mean by motor learning. And a very layman kind of definition is any practice-dependent change in motor performance. So you practice and your motor performance changes, and for all practical purposes, we will call that motor learning, that ability as motor learning. And then the next question that you might ask is, why should anybody care? And nothing works better than a bunch of statistics to answer these kinds of questions. So here you go. Stroke is the second leading cause of death worldwide after cardiac disease. And this is some data from the West, particularly the United States. In India, this tends to be less well characterized. But, and this is again old data, almost 8 years ago, where it was reported that, about 6.7 million people died from stroke. And somebody in the US has a stroke every 4 minutes. The problem with stroke is people have to live with long-term disability. Okay. I mean, if you compare numbers in India, it says that, in India, there's about 1.8 million new strokes every year. That's one new case every 18 seconds. I mean, compare that to the US, where there's one death every 4 minutes. And like I was saying earlier, majority of the people who have a stroke survive, but then, live with long-term disability, and about 70% of those people require assistance with average activities of daily living. And this is a huge economic and social cost. And what we need to do is get these people to be functionally independent so that some of these costs can be reduced. Of course, a lot of this stuff is driven by economics and money and not by science, which is a pathetic thing, but that's the way it is. But the point is that if we have to get these people to be functionally independent, then we need rehabilitation. We need to get these people up and about again, right? And we can define rehabilitation as the ability to relearn movements that we've lost because of this neurological injury, in this case, stroke. And so our idea is that if we understand how movements are learned, we can perhaps design better rehabilitation strategies and approaches. So that's one reason why we should study motor learning. But then there's also this practical reason, which is that we as a society are obsessed with people who can make skilled movements, right? Who are at the pinnacle of motor performance. And if you take any of these people and think about the amount of money they make in whatever, right? I mean, in contracts and endorsements and things like that, it is ridiculous. Which again goes back to the point that we monetarily value people who make skilled movements. I mean, it's bizarre, but we pay hundreds of crores of rupees to Sachin Tendulkar when all he's doing really is drive a ball to the edge of a field using a piece of wood. And there's another funny example that John Krakauer, who's a leading neurologist at Johns Hopkins, gives, which is if aliens came down from outer space, how would you explain to them that 6 billion people watched the Football World Cup, which is essentially 22 grown men running around a circular ball. So it's very bizarre that we are obsessed with sportsmen. We are obsessed with people who make these fine movements, whether it is dance or music and things like that. And we as neuroscientists want to understand the neural basis of this. What drives one to become an expert in making really, really, really skilled movements? That's another motivation to study motor learning. And then you can ask another question is, okay, if you're interested in studying motor learning, what level should you study the system at? And this is, this kind of problem is getting a lot of attention in the field these days. And our approach here in the lab is heavily inspired by David Marr, who studied vision. Was a vision neuroscientist back in the West, and what Marr said, that you could study the system at 3 levels, right? So he defines, I should use a laser pointer. So he said you could define the problem at a computational level, which is what is the computational problem that the system is trying to solve. In our example, it would be what is the person trying to do, which is become skilled at a particular task. The second level that you can study the system at is, okay, the algorithmic level, which is you could call this the mechanistic level. What are the rules or algorithms that people or animals are using to solve this computational problem of learning? And the third is the implementation level, which is how is all this realized in the biological substrate that we call a brain. And what Marr said was, Marr gave a beautiful example of bird flight. So the red color here is the computational problem, which is you trying to understand how birds fly. The algorithmic level is the flapping of wings. That's the mechanism. And the third thing is, okay, wings are made up of feathers, and therefore feathers must be important. And what Marr was suggesting was that there is simply no way that you can understand the computational problem of bird flight, as an example, by only studying the feathers, right? And so neuroscience today is replete with studies that that are focused on the implementation level. We are getting better and better at technology. We are getting better and better at collecting data. We are getting better and better at analyzing data. We can now image at single synapses. The question that is being asked is that going to be enough to explain behavior? And the answer that Marr a long time ago said that is not going to be enough. So what Marr was suggesting, in fact, was you study the behavioral level first. This is how it should go. You study one, that suggests possible mechanism, and then the mechanisms might predict how it might be realized in the brain, and that should be the first step. And then you can go backwards from there as well. So that's the approach. Our approach is heavily inspired by that. What this is showing in the bottom right corner is the bias, okay, where we stand today. This is what I was referring to earlier. Too many studies and too much research is focused on level 3, when what should ideally be happening is this bit up here. We should be going from 1 to 2 to 3, and not 3 to 2 to 1, because that's impossible. So our approach is heavily inspired by this, where we are looking at, a certain behavior. And then this is what, as I go through the talk, maybe this will become a little more apparent. But we are going through a behavior. We're trying to figure out what mechanisms gives rise to that behavior. And then finally, we get to how, what are the neural substrates that are essential for that mechanism to be implemented. Okay. Uh, so how is motor learning studied? There are two prominent approaches: motor adaptation. This is what I was talking about earlier as well, but I'll go in a little more detail here. The task is the following, typically, okay, which is you make a bunch of movements, and then you are exposed to some kind of perturbation. Okay, that perturbation knocks you off your, pre-perturbation, or let's say baseline level of performance, and now you start seeing a lot of errors in your movement. And over time, despite the perturbation being present, your behavior improves, your errors decrease, and you get back more or less to baseline levels of performance. And once that perturbation is removed, you show these after effects. But if you look at, the net change, whether you've gotten better than baseline, the answer is generally no. Okay, so there's not been any change in skill as such. You've just been able to learn how to account for the effects of the perturbation that has been externally applied. So this is motor adaptation. And the other form is skill, right? This would be more like sports, dance, piano, things like that, where you have a certain level of performance and then no perturbations applied. You simply do a lot of practice and then you get better than baseline, and then you retain it. Okay, and there could be multiple factors that affect retention and all that. But on a net scale, you've become better than baseline levels. And so what we study both in our lab, but today, we will talk about motor adaptation primarily. Okay, the typical setup that looks like this for the studies that we did, it wasn't exactly this setup, but it should tell you, the kinds of the general task environment. Okay, so a person who is not generally bald sits at a tabletop. We have a digitizing tablet, and the person holds on to a stylus, and they make movements on the digitizing tablet. So these movements are restricted to the horizontal plane. You can't lift the stylus off the tablet. There's a mirror that is placed at a certain height above the tablet, and above the mirror at more or less the same height is a flat screen TV that's mounted horizontally. And this TV is connected to the computer. The computer plays some games over here. These games are largely in the form of, okay, here is a start position, get in there, a target will show up, move to the target. Okay, it's incredibly boring, but we do our best song and dance to keep people happy so that they cooperate. The nice thing about this setup is that you can dissociate what people see from what they actually do, because the mirror blocks the view of the hand. So people don't see their hand, so they're just making these movements on the tablet, and then we do show feedback about their motion on this display, which is then reflected on the mirror. But because of this, this pseudo virtual reality kind of environment, we can dissociate how this feedback appears relative to what the hand is doing underneath, right? And this is a somewhat different setup where we've used sensors placed on the hand, the elbow and the shoulder, if we want to record joint angles and things like that. But the data that I will show doesn't come from this setup. Okay, so what tasks do people do? And the task that we have used for this study is nothing novel. There's been hundreds of studies using this task. It's very, very common. But I told you that we study motor adaptation, and the way motor adaptation requires that you introduce a perturbation to the limb, or at least the feedback of how the limb is moving as people make movements. So the typical task runs like this. So there's a start position. People get their hand in, their hand meaning that stylus. we show them a cursor that is, when the hand is in the start circle, it's matched to the hand, and then they're expected to go to a target when they hear a beep. Okay. So they do a bunch of those baseline movements. It's fairly straightforward. You just keep going, nothing happens. You keep getting points as reward, and you accumulate a lot of those points. But then what happens is, after you've done a bunch of those, we introduce this perturbation. Okay, and this perturbation is called a visuomotor rotation. You can choose whatever magnitude you want, and I will play a movie. This is a movie, and I'll show you what happens when a visuomotor rotation is introduced. But the idea is to, again, to introduce errors in the movement. And this is done by dissociating what the hand does. So the hand will continue going straight to the target, right? Because that's what you're used to in these baseline movements. And you expect that the cursor will also go with the hand, because that is what has been happening in the baseline trials. But then when we introduce this visuomotor rotation, the cursor will go off in a different direction. In this case, it'll be an angle of 30 degrees. And this is what it looks like. I hope this plays. So you'll see two trajectories. You'll see a hand go straight, that will be white. But then this cursor yellow will go off to the left there at an angle of 30 degrees. And because people don't see their hand, they're only told bring the cursor to the target. They will correct that motion. So you'll see the cursor go off like that, and they'll bring the cursor here, and the hand will go straight and end up here. Okay, so let's see if it plays. No, it didn't play. Let me see. 1 second. Okay. Here. Okay. All right. So you see that. So that is the first time that people actually experience that kind of perturbation. So hand goes straight, but then cursor goes off. People bring the cursor to the target, and hand ends up in a different location. Okay. The interesting thing is, if you continue doing this, if you keep people exposed to this kind of perturbation, they will start moving the hand off in the wrong direction. They will start moving the hand 30 degrees, in this case to the right, to make the cursor go straight. People implicitly want this cursor to go straight. Okay, and you'll see that. So over a few trials, this is what will start to happen. The cursor motion becomes straighter, the hand starts going off, and towards the end, the hand goes off essentially by 30 degrees, right? Because 30 degrees is the magnitude of the perturbation, the cursor goes off straight. And what you can do is you can characterize this change in angle, okay? This change in angle here as a measure of adaptation, okay? And that is what we do. But here's what the actual data looks like. So here's a baseline movement. In this case, the target is to the right. This is the start position. People simply go. There's nothing odd here. If any of us did this movement, we would see, this kind of a straight line, relatively straight line motion that is done. When the perturbation is first experienced, the cursor goes off like that, and then the movement is corrected to bring the cursor near the target. Late learning, the rotation is still there. Remember that the rotation is still there, but people have adapted so that the cursor is now going straight again to the target, just like baseline, but the hand is going off like that. Okay, I'm not showing the hand here. And then you remove the perturbation, and because the hand was going here, and now the rotation is no longer present, the cursor goes with the hand, and you get a trajectory that looks like this, right? So early learning and After Effects look somewhat opposite to each other. Okay, we of course do this in many directions, so that's what it looks like. They don't always correct. That's okay, but you see these squiggly movements early on, which become straighter with practice, and then you get oppositely directed After Effects. And if you quantify this change in angle, people going off early and then becoming straighter later, that plot kind of looks like this, where the initial trials are close to 30 degrees, and then people improve. This sign doesn't really matter. It just depends on how you calculate what is positive relative to the target and what is negative. You can do the rotation in any direction. You can either make the cursor go left or right, and you will get the opposite effects. And the sign really is just a factor of which direction that perturbation is implemented. Okay, so that's it. So that's adaptation. Okay, what do we know about this, right? So we know that many mechanisms contribute. Okay, and this is where it starts getting a little more serious and a little more relevant to what we've done. What are these mechanisms? So one possibility that has recently been pushed a lot is that a lot of this learning is actually strategic or cognitive, or you can actually, people can actually tell explicitly what they did to compensate for this perturbation. Okay, but then that helps. How does that help? That helps to reduce errors quickly. You see the cursor going left, you say, oh crap, maybe I need to move to the right, and that's a deliberate strategy to cancel the error that's introduced by the perturbation. But then the older literature suggests that a lot of this kind of learning is dominated by these slower implicit processes that you can't really verbalize, right? So this would be akin to saying, okay, tell me how you learned to swim, and there's not really you can't describe it very well. Or tell me how you learned to ride a bicycle. You can't describe that very well. So that's what I mean by these implicit, this is just tacit knowledge, right? This is non-verbalizable mechanisms that contribute to this kind of learning. So there's things in between. There's reinforcement learning that contributes. There's other operant mechanisms that also play a role. But the field these days is dominated by these two, the cognitive strategic mechanisms that are essentially related to re-aiming, right? Versus the slower implicit processes. And we also know that the acquired memory as a consequence of this learning comprises of these effector-specific and effector-independent components. And we are focusing here in this work on the effector-independent component, and the manifestation, the behavioral manifestation of the effector-independent component is interlimb generalization, which means that if you learn with one limb and test on the other, some of that learning will generalize or transfer over to the other. Okay, and the question that we pursued here, this is where I'm attacking now the first level, right, which is the behavioral level, which is which of the multiple. The computational level is, what we're trying to explain is this effector independent memory formation and generalization. That's the behavioral problem, right? And then the question is, okay, which of these multiple mechanisms, the strategies, the implicit processes, reinforcement, what is it that gives rise to the formation of these effector independent memories? That's our main question. So let's look at some possibilities. One, of course, is those fast processes, right? And there's been some support for that idea that came sort of early 2000s. But then in 2011, there were 2 or 3 more studies that showed that doesn't fully explain it. This transfer from, let's say, the left limb to the right or the right limb to the left cannot really be explained by these fast cognitive mechanisms. And so we asked, okay, are these slower mechanisms playing a role? And what we predicted was that if it is indeed true that these slower mechanisms are driving the learning, then the magnitude of generalization, how much transfers, should be predicted better by the slow process, the slower mechanism, rather than the faster mechanism, when both of these are actually contributing to learning. Okay. Okay, so how do we do that? So here's our task. You learn something with the right arm. You learn a clockwise rotation. Okay, in this case, the cursor is going off to the right. The cursor is indicated by this red crosshair. We call that task A. You learn it, and then you're exposed again to the same task with your opposite limb. Okay, in this case, the left limb. Very simple task. We had 8 groups, 4 groups learn with the right arm and are tested with the left. The other 4 groups learn with the left arm and are tested with the right. Now, how do these groups vary? They vary in terms of the number of trials that they have to learn for. Okay, so one of the groups is going to learn for 40, another is 80, another is 160, and the fourth is 320. And then you have the same set of learning trials for the other, 2 arms into 4 sets. So that's our 8 groups. What does this do? Okay, this allows us to capture different levels of these slow and fast processes, and I'll show you some computational work that will make this clearer. So if you have experienced fewer trials, some of these slower mechanisms are yet to kick in. Okay, versus if you've done 320 trials, then you have a lot of slow components. These mechanisms that emerge slowly. And so now varying the number of learning trials allows you to distinguish, or capture different levels of these learning processes and look at their contribution to this transfer that will occur, right arm to the left or left arm to the right. Okay, the generalization test was always with 40 trials of the untrained arm. And this is an interesting thing that we do, which is we always compare the same arms. So what we're going to do is compare naive right arm performance, which is this group, this R to L. So when they first learn, and we are going to compare what right arm performance looks like in this group. Okay, in this group, what is the difference? In this group, left arm is going to learn after the right, so we don't care. So this group is learning naively with the right arm. And in this group, the right arm is going to learn after the left arm has already undergone learning. Okay, so if the right arm does better, okay, after the left arm has already learned compared to naive performance, then we say that learning has occurred. Okay, and again, this will become clearer with the data, but this is just our task design. So here's what naive learning looks like. Okay, so this is the 40 trial group. The solid line is the first trial. Again, this is the cursor going off because of the rotation. And then the dotted is the last trial, the cursor going straight to the target. Again, nothing surprising. You've seen this before when I showed, the squiggly line and then the straighter movements, right? 80 trials, first and last, 160, 320. Okay, so nothing very surprising. People are exposed to the perturbation. The perturbation for all of them is the same, 30 degrees to the left. Okay, to the right. It's just that we plot this differently. Okay, so now you see this. I mean, there's no difference that you can tell between any of these groups. If I showed you this and asked you, tell me which one is 40 and which one is 320, you'd say, I don't know, I can't tell the difference. When you look at the learning curve, so here's the 30-degree error, right, which you get first because the perturbation is 30 degrees. So essentially, it's the angle between the line connecting the start circle and the target, and the line connecting the start position with the point of peak velocity here. Okay, so that error is 30 degrees, and then it reduces with practice. This is kind of that learning curve that I had showed you that was going from the negative up. Okay, 80 looks like that. People practice for 80 trials. They learn 160, 320. Okay, that's what this looks like. Now, what you see is, within 40 trials, people learn. If you looked at the final level of learning for the 40 versus the 320, it's not different. And then this is what happens with the right arm. So what I showed you on top was the left arm naive learning. Right arm also doesn't look very different. These are the 4 groups, 40 trials, 80, 160, 320. Okay, so nothing very surprising here. People are exposed to this perturbation and they improve with practice over time. Okay, so now let's look at generalization, right? So what does the left arm performance look like after the right arm has learned already? So now what I'm showing you is the thin line is the naive learning with the left arm. Okay, if I go back, it's essentially this blue line, okay, that I'm replotting here. Okay, but then the thick line is the left arm performance after the right arm has already undergone learning, right? And you see that they overlap. for the, at least in the 40 trial group. Okay, 80 again doesn't look very different. 160 again doesn't look very different. 320 again doesn't look very different. Okay, and you can quantify what these angles are, and you can compare them. Again, there's no difference whatsoever. So what we call direction error, which is that angle, this angle here, is close to 30 degrees for when in the naive condition, but it's also close to 30 degrees in the generalization condition. What does this mean? This means that if you've practiced something with the right arm and then you test on the left, nothing's going to generalize. Okay, things are not transferring from your right arm to the left. Okay, at least in this kind of an experiment. Okay, no matter how much you practice. Okay, you do it for 320 trials and then still there's nothing that these trials with the left arm, naive learning versus exposure after the right arm has undergone learning, just look the same. Okay, all right, now let's look at right arm performance after left arm learning. Okay, now with 40 trials there's not much of a difference. Okay, I'm plotting the same data. So this thin red line is the same as that naive learning line that I showed you earlier. And then this is what happens when the right arm is tested after left arm has already undergone learning. Okay, look what starts to happen though. With 80 trials, you start to see some separation between the two, right? With 160, it's a little more, and with 320, it's a lot more. It's not perfect. Okay, the right arm is not going straight to the target, but it's not making 30-degree errors either. Okay, so these two don't overlap. And if you look at the actual direction error across all subjects and things like that, what you find is that the errors start reducing with more practice. Okay, that is one. And the second is that there is, what we are calling transfer from the left arm to the right. What this, the take home really from this slide is that the right arm does better, okay, if the left arm has already been trained before the right arm is actually tested on the same perturbation. Okay, so that's the message here, that learning generalizes robustly from the left arm to the right and scales with the number of practice trials. Okay, so just to quickly summarize the behavioral results so far: no transfer from right to left, lots of transfer from left to right, and the more you practice with the left arm, the better your right arm does. Okay, so now we get into the mechanism. Remember, our original question is it the fast process or is it the slow process? And here we used a model that was first proposed by Maurice Smith and colleagues at
Right.
Yes.
Sorry, just interrupt.
Yes, sure.
This asymmetry, is it only in right-handed people?
Yes. So yes, I should have mentioned that. This is all right-handed people, strongly right-handed. If a left-hander shows up in our lab, we tell them, don't ever show us your face ever.
Okay.
Okay. No, some of my students are left-handed. I'm just making jokes. Yeah. So all this is right-handers data, and we can come back to left-handers, at the end, because left-handers will be a different kind of a population. So let's look at these two processes. Okay, and what is shown on the top graph here is this perturbation schedule. Forget the green and the gray for a minute. Okay, but here's baseline where there's no perturbation applied. So all the white space is no perturbation. And then there's some perturbation. In our case, it was a 30-degree rotation that stays on for a while. And then, you don't worry about this green and gray. Okay, so, that's the nature of the perturbation. The purple line here is simulated behavior. Essentially what this is saying is, okay, in baseline, you don't make too many errors, but then there is an error, and then you account for the effects of those errors, and you learn. But then this purple line is the sum of these two black lines. Okay, the solid black line is what is called the fast process. Okay, so which rises rapidly. You can't see the rise here because it's hidden behind the purple, but then decays over time. And then this dotted line here is the slow process, which comes on slowly, but then stays on for a while and doesn't decay rapidly either. Okay, so that the decay is shown in these green and gray parts, but that's not really of importance to us. But the point is that you have these two processes now that are driving a change in behavior or are driving learning. One is really fast, okay, and decays also fast. So learns quickly but also forgets quickly. And then the dotted line is learns slowly, retains well. Okay, and you can do this, you can characterize this using these equations. This is a state space model. X is a hidden state, and the error on any given trial is some internal, representation that you have of that state, subtracted out from the perturbation that you apply. So perturbation on the first trial, your perturbation is, let's say, 30, right? Because it's a 30-degree rotation. You have no idea about what that perturbation is. So X of 1 is 0. And so on the first trial, your error is close to 30 degrees. And you use that error to update these two states. Okay, so the XS is the slow state, and the XF is the fast state. And the XS on trial n+1 is given by this equation. Essentially, it is what you remember from your previous learning plus what is the error that you experienced on the current trial, right? So A is called the retention factor, and B is a measure of or estimate of learning rate. Okay, and it's the same error E of n that drives the update in the fast and slow processes. And you constrain the equation such that the learning rate for the fast process is greater than the learning rate for the slow process. I mean that the names make it obvious, but then the retention in the slow process is better than the retention in the fast process. So these are constraints you impose on the model, and you do this iteratively across trials. And you can then look at what the state of the slow process is, what the state of the fast process is, and how these two combine to give you your net state. Eventually, at the end of learning, what should happen is that xn should be 30. So it should match the perturbation amplitude, and your error should go down to 0. Okay, I'm running out of time. I should hurry up. I have a lot more to talk about. But then there was this paper in 2011 which said that the fast process is equivalent to an explicit verbalizable strategic process, and the slow is more implicit and non-verbalizable. So what we did was we said, okay, we know that learning generalizes from the left to the right arm. Let us look at how it relates to these slow versus fast learning process. So this is essentially a correlation. So we look at the magnitude of generalization for people who learned for 40 trials, 80 trials, 160 trials, 320 trials. And we've plotted that here, right? And then this green line here is the net motor output, which looks like this purple line here. Okay, so this is the net change in hand angle, and you see that the fit is very poor, right? So the red and the green and the blue and the gray are all off. They're not sitting on this. The idea is that if net learning, if how much you learned was determining how much you generalize, then these dots should have sat along this curve. This is the fast component. Again, you remember that it rises rapidly, but then also decays quickly. And again, the fit is very poor, right? And then this is the slow component, right? I mean, beautiful fit. So essentially what this is saying is my slow component rises slowly, and the how much you generalize tags along, right? And then you can actually look at the state. So the actual state of these fast and slow processes, do a correlation, and you find a beautiful correlation between the state of the slow process, which is what is the value of that slow component at the end of 40 trials, or at the end of 80 trials, or at the end of 160, or at the end of 320. Correlate that with the amount of generalization, and you get an R-square of like 0.99. And these two are highly nonlinear. So you would go like this, and like this. So bottom line again is that the generalization is going to be best predicted by the level of the slow process, and not the fast, and not the net learning achieved at the end of these different learning trials. Okay, you might say, okay, look, you compare different groups of subjects, because I told you originally that we are comparing the right arm naive learning with right arm after left arm learning. These two are coming from different groups of subjects, and that's not fair. You should compare within subject. We do that here on this slide. And again, what you find is the same thing, even the within subject generalization magnitude, which is simply left arm minus right arm, okay, within the same person. Uh, Again, is predicted nicely by the slow component. There's one outlier sitting here. We just showed that separately. And then again, this very nice correlation. Okay, so this relationship between generalization or transfer and the slow process holds even when generalization is calculated on a within subject basis. And then, what you could also say is that, look, you fit the model to the learning data itself, and of course everything's going to correlate. So what we did was this, this control experiment where we got a completely different group of subjects, had them learn with the left arm. There's no right arm learning here at all. Okay, there's no right arm exposure to the perturbation at all. We had them learn with the left arm only. We calculated the model parameters from this data, okay, from a completely different experiment, and then correlated the fast and slow state estimates that we got from this data to the generalization that we saw in our other data, right? So these two are now completely different experiments. And I will show you that it still perfectly matches. The green line again is the net output of the model fit to the behavioral data, which is shown in these beige lines. So these beige lines is what people actually do. The green line is the model fit. The maroon colored line is the fast state, and this is the orange line is the slow state. There's this interesting behavior that you see here that we can discuss later on. That's not the point. So now what we've done is we've estimated the fast and slow state values from this data and tried to correlate that with the generalization that we saw in the other experiment. Again, you find the same thing, very poor fits to the net learning and the fast component, but good fits, relatively good fits to the slow state. Okay, so this relationship is just as robust when fast and slow states are derived using a completely different perturbation schedule. I mean, perturbation schedule simply means that this, what kind of perturbation we imposed at what trial. Okay. All right, so I hope what I've convinced you is that this generalization occurs from the left arm to the right, but not vice versa. Generalization is best predicted by the slow implicit process, and this slow process might therefore be driving the encoding of the effector independent memory, of which this generalization is a behavioral manifestation. Okay, so quickly, what I will do is talk about the neuroanatomical basis, because I said that the approach, is heavily inspired by Marr. Now we're getting down to that final implementation level. Okay, so there is evidence that these motor memories that you acquire as a consequence of learning are encoded in M1. There's lots and lots of studies that talk about it. The funny thing is that when you try and disrupt M1 activity, it does nothing to the generalization. Okay, so you can tinker with M1 till the cows come home, test for generalization, and it's there. Okay, so it does not seem to influence this effector independent component. Okay, so we said, okay, is the posterior parietal cortex a reasonable alternative? And based on what? Based on a number of studies. Okay, some imaging work where if you move, let's say, the hand and the foot, which are two different effectors, and look at overlapping areas of activation, you would find them in intraparietal sulcus. This appears to hold even at the neuronal level, where the same neuron would code for different effectors. But then there's some studies that contradict this, so who knows? And even if this is the case, even if the parietal cortex is a reasonable alternative to M1, as sort of the basis for storage of these effector independent memories, none of these studies actually establish causality. Okay, so we said that we can establish that the posterior parietal cortex is the seat of these effector independent representations if we can show that if you disrupt posterior parietal cortex prior to learning, it blocks the slow process, right? Because that is what predicts generalization. And if you block it after learning, then it should block generalization. So you allow people to learn, hit posterior parietal cortex using some disrupting mechanism. And then once you do that, it should block how much learning transfers. So we tested this. Here's our protocol, baseline movements, 15 minutes high definition transcranial direct current stimulation after baseline. Then they start learning. The last 5 minutes of stimulation overlap with the first few trials of learning. So there's some overlap between TDCS, and for 10 minutes they're sitting quietly. For the last 5 minutes they start doing this task where they're exposed to this 30-degree rotation, and then we test for after effects. Here's what that TDCS looks like. Here's the electric field intensity. So the white circle here on each of these will show you where the central electrode is placed, and the nature of the current. So it's not very, very focal, but it'll hit the area that you want and be somewhat focal at least. So we do this. We apply 2 milliamperes current cathodal. Cathodal will inhibit the underlying tissue for 15 minutes, and we applied it over P3 and P4 regions that you get from the EEG 1020 EEG system. And then of course we do real stimulation and we do sham stimulation. Okay, so what does the data look like? These are the controls. So these are sham stimulation. Okay, so first trial, people go off. Again, you've perhaps tired of looking at this now. And then last trial, people become straight. Again, first trial, people go off. Last trial, people become straight. What is interesting is now when you do real posterior parietal cortex stimulation over the left hemisphere, the first trial is curved. Of course, it is going to be curved, but the last trial is also curved, right? So it's as if people never learn. Okay, now this is a somewhat extreme. People do learn a little bit, and I'll show you the group data. But the bottom line is people don't become straight. Okay, people don't move like the controls do. And that is different somewhat from what the right hemisphere stimulation does. Okay, so people go off, and then people improve over time. In this example, this is one trial from one subject. It's not perfectly overlapping, but it's relatively straight, and there you can see the improvement, right? And the group data looks like this. Let's look at the right hemisphere stimulation first. Baseline, you knock people off baseline, they get better, they don't get down to zero for whatever reason. And then when you remove the perturbation, it's the after effect, and people get back to baseline as well. There's no difference between the real and the sham stimulation here. Okay, and these solid lines that you see here, again, that slow and fast model fit that we did to this data. Whereas here you see that where there is some improvement, about 50%, but it's not as much as the control. So it looks like this left posterior parietal stimulation is really hitting this late stage learning here. In the early stage is not very, very different. You can see some overlap here. Okay, and you can ask, okay, what is the definition of early versus late? How many trials? How many minutes? I have no idea. Okay, but let's call this portion early and this portion late. You can see that there's some overlap of the data here, and there's not much overlap here. And this is some fancy statistics that we did to show the same thing. You can not do the model, and you can show the same data with model-free analyses. And early on, there's no difference, early learning, between any of these four groups. But in the late stages of learning, when I say early learning here, what I mean is first 25 trials. Okay, so there's no difference there. And then trial 25 onwards, you see that the errors in the left posterior parietal cortex stimulation group remain high, whereas these others get better. Okay. All right. So a conclusion: disrupting left but not right PPC impedes learning. mediated specifically by the slow process and not the fast. Okay, so fine. So we've established, number one, that the slow process is in fact impeded with parietal stimulation, and there's a lateralized effect here with the left but not the right stimulation causing the failure to learn. And then we also finally did this last check. Okay, what would happen if you now applied TDCS after people have learned? The task remains the same, except we didn't do right hemisphere stimulation now, because this work had just established that right hemisphere stimulation doesn't matter. So we only did left hemisphere stimulation. Real or sham, again, task remains the same. In this case now, after learning, we're going to apply the TDCS and then test for generalization. Now, of course, the sham group is also sitting there. It's not that the sham group is tested immediately after learning and they are showing generalization, but they're also sitting there just for 15 minutes doing nothing. Okay. Okay. Let's look at, pre-TDCS learning. Is there any difference at all between the groups that got real and sham stimulation? No difference. There should not be. Okay. Why would anything be different here? If you just got randomly 10 subjects in the real, 10 subjects in the sham, this is what it would look like. You don't expect differences. You don't see any. Now you give TDCS, and now you test what happens with the right arm. Remember, we're only doing left to right arm generalization testing with left hemisphere stimulation. Okay, and we find something very interesting, which is that the sham groups show reduced direction error with the right arm, which means that learning generalizes from the left arm to the right. They are better, even though the perturbation is 30 degrees. The error that they start off with is close to 17 degrees. So there's that difference. But the groups that got the real stimulation, the posterior parietal cortex left hemisphere real stimulation, they're actually sitting at 30. So a perturbation of 30, you start off at 30, which means nothing came from the other side. And here's some other control groups that we did. We also got an M1 stimulation group, left hemisphere. They also generalize. And then there's this naive learning group, which is not different from the posterior parietal cortex group. And that data is being shown here. So we test only for 40 trials. This is the posterior parietal stimulation right arm data. And this is just naive learning, okay, for 40 trials, and they overlap, okay, which means that, what you did with your TDCS perhaps just wiped out that learning that you had acquired with the left arm. And it was as if people were starting from scratch again. They were not very different from people who were in fact starting from scratch, which is the gray line. Okay, so post-learning PPC stimulation blocks inter-effector generalization. So we've confirmed that as well. So I'll quickly wrap up. I'm just about in time to put everything together. Okay, we've tested right-handed people. We know from a lot of past work that when you learn something, you develop not only these effector-specific components, but also effector-independent representations. We have shown that, the algorithm, we have shown the mechanism through which these effector-independent representations are built. Our data shows that these are built through these slower implicit learning mechanisms. Disrupting left posterior parietal cortex prior to learning impedes this mechanism specifically, perhaps blocking the encoding of these memories. And post-learning inhibition will block generalization. And this arrangement is very useful. It's consistent with the role of a lot of studies have suggested that the posterior parietal cortex might actually be holding these abstract functional memory structures, and it then makes sense to put something that is effector independent, something that is abstract, a little more abstract than just what muscle am I going to activate in posterior parietal cortex, if that is what the posterior parietal cortex is known to be holding. Okay, and this is just the closing statement that Richard Anderson and colleagues at Caltech have done a lot of work showing that the higher order aspects of movement intention, decision making, things like that are actually available in posterior parietal cortex. And now you're putting these effector independent representations there as well. And what that could do is facilitate this optimal movement planning, where you specify certain movement parameters independent of which effector you're going to move. Okay, so that's it. These guys really did all the work. I just take credit for it. I'm shameless. And funding, hopefully it'll continue. That's it. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I will perhaps stop sharing my screen for the moment. And if we have to go back to the data, I can start sharing again, so we can have some discussion. Okay. Yes.
So thanks a lot, Pratik. I have a couple of quick questions.
Yes.
So this asymmetry that you're talking about between right to left to right, anatomically, can you trace it to some kind of asymmetry in corpus callosum connections?
I don't know. I don't know if it's the corpus callosum or something else that is causing this. What I believe, and this is the working hypothesis across a lot of studies in the lab, is that you have these two hemispheres that have become specialized for different things. The left hemisphere is specialized for learning, okay, and learning many different things. Whereas the right hemisphere is perhaps specialized for dealing with new situations, okay, where movements have to be guided under changing task conditions and switching and things like that. Now, so what our belief is that for things like adaptation, we have to test this out with skill really, but for things like adaptation, the representation actually gets built in the left hemisphere only, okay, and whatever, if there is some right hemisphere representation, it's very weak, and so the right arm has direct access to that representation that can be built even with left arm learning, okay, but that's not necessarily the case for the left arm, right? So that access to that memory that is now being stored in the left hemisphere is asymmetric somehow. Now, whether that's related to asymmetry in corpus callosum connections or something else, we really don't know. But there is an asymmetry in access. That is what is clear from this data.
Okay, great. My second question is, you have this fast and slow process, right?
Yes.
So you are saying the slow process is linked to the PPC, basically cortical.
Yes.
Can we say the fast process is linked to basal ganglia?
So this is something that we want to test. So we've done some recent work now. Hopefully these papers will go out soon, where we are probing these explicit processes specifically, right? And these we believe are more cognitive, because they're related to re-aiming, okay, and what we have said in the discussion of these papers don't test the neural basis of the fast process yet, okay, but what we have said in the discussion is exactly what you're saying, that is perhaps basal ganglia and frontal cortical region connections that are responsible for the fast process, but then the parietal cerebellar connections that are perhaps responsible for the implicit component.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Something to test.
Right. Yeah. Great. Excellent work. Really like.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else?
If nobody has a question, I will start talking again.
Your students won't ask you because there is a pact of, I don't know, they're supposed to be quiet and all that.
Sorry?
Your students won't ask you questions, I guess. There's some.
Oh, no, the IIT Madras students should. These guys are.
They should ask, yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Sundari?
Sir?
Yes.
Yeah, good evening. So
Hi.
actually, I'm a medical student in Madurai Medical College over here.
Yeah.
Okay, what I have a doubt is that you showed that, what to say, stimulating the left cortex, PPC cortex, inhibits that learning.
Yes.
Yeah, and as sir asked about the asymmetry and symmetry, my question is, since you have tested only the right-handed people,
Right.
are you getting those results, or are they really asymmetric? Like suppose if we tested in the left-handed people, stimulating the right hemisphere may have an effect.
Yeah. So if you got left-handers that were mirror imaged right-handers, then the hypothesis or the prediction is that yes, you would flip this around. But a lot of left-handers are actually not left-handers, right? They will claim that they're left-handed because they write with the left hand. But if you actually gave them a questionnaire, and this is what we do to establish handedness, you give there's a little questionnaire of 35 items, and it has all kinds of questions. Which if you're holding a jar, which hand will you use to hold versus open the lid, things like that. If you were to throw something, what arm would you use? If you were to write something, what would you use? Things like that. So if you have these left-handers answer those questions, it turns out that there are some things that they do with the left hand, and some that they do with the right. My son is like that. He's 6. He bats lefty, but then everything else he'll do with the right hand. So these people tend to be a little more mixed-handed. Okay, and what happens in these individuals, we don't know whether it's still lateralized, whether it's divided between the two hemispheres, whether it's still lateralized to the left, whether it's divided between the two hemisphere, or whether it's flipped over and goes to the right hemisphere. Is very hard to predict. And these are not ambidextrous people that I'm talking about. Okay, these are mixed handers, which is different from ambidextrous. Ambidextrous, again, we have no idea whether they're going to be equally good or equally bad at tasks like this with the two arms, and what their neural representation is going to be.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
There is an interesting paper that has just come out, which is looking at people who are born without hands. Okay, and they are put in an fMRI scanner, and they're asked to wiggle their toes. Okay, so they're asked to do certain tasks with their toes. So these people are they're born without hands, so presumably handedness as such is we don't know, right, what their handedness is. But the interesting thing is when these people move their toes and they look at the areas of activation and compare them to areas of activation in controls who use the hand for the same task. Okay, they find overlapping areas of activation in left posterior parietal cortex. It's amazing. So there's something about this region. Perhaps these people would have been right-handed if they had hands, but we don't know, right? But that's what these findings show, that left posterior parietal cortex is something special about it in terms of holding these. In our case it was 2 arms. In other cases it has been an arm and a leg. It doesn't matter, something effector independent.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, so I had a question. So this is maybe a little away from the topic that you covered. So your topic about how it could be an effect of right hand dominant people, the transfer of learning from left arm to right arm could be because they were right-handed people. So that sort of a result, what sort of an influence would it have on stroke rehabilitation? So like would would that really?
Yes, it certainly does. So what this means, so, and as I was telling you before we started the talk, that the emphasis here will be on the left hemisphere. But in the past, during my postdoc, I've done work with right hemisphere stroke patients also. Okay, along with left hemisphere stroke. So what we find with right hemisphere stroke is that the nature of the deficits is completely different from this. If you have a stroke, and what we had tested was right frontal, okay, so dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and below inferior frontal and things like that. What we had found was you expose them to this exact same visuomotor rotation task, and what happens is, when they're first exposed to the rotation, how these people correct, how we saw corrections in most of our subjects, they go off and then they move the hand, so you get those squiggly flower looking things. They don't show that, okay, they just go straight and then never correct, okay. Then what happens is you keep them exposed to this rotation and they will learn without any problems whatsoever. You remove the perturbation, again the hand goes off in the opposite direction, and normal people, healthy controls would correct back, they'd fail to correct, okay, these people with right frontal strokes. But there is an after effect, right? So learning doesn't seem to be a problem, okay, but if you put them in switching task conditions, that seems to be a big problem with right hemisphere damage. So what this tells you is that the nature of your rehab protocol needs to be different if you've had a left versus a right stroke. Perhaps, if you want to train somebody with, and make somebody remember, it's going to be a lot more challenging with left than right strokes. Right strokes will have problems if you keep switching between task conditions, but left strokes will have problems with learning anything. And so you perhaps may want to try, some of these cognitive strategies and things like that to help them improve their movements. Because the nice thing about the motor system is that there are redundant pathways. So if pathway 1 or that contributes to mechanism 1 is affected and damaged and there's no hope, then you try and exploit pathway 2, which is mechanism 2, right? And so some of these strategies or reinforcement mechanisms or something like that would have to be done, particularly for left hemisphere strokes, but not so much for right hemisphere. All this needs to be tested out, really. But this work is headed in that direction. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Any more questions? Okay. I mean, I'm happy to answer more questions if anybody has any. Otherwise, it's over to Sundari and yeah.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Sundari, vote of thanks.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Dr. Pratik Mehta, for that wonderful talk. It was really amazing. And thank you for everyone else who attended too.
All right.
So thanks a lot for all the IIT Gandhinagar students. Most welcome. We should have more of these meetings.
Yes.
Occasional journal club or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Good to see you guys and stay